All right. Hello, everybody. Good evening. All right. Welcome to the Art Institute of Chicago. My name is Sarah Kelly Oler, and I'm the Field McCormick Chair and Curator of Arts of the Americas here at the museum, as well as the Vice President of Curatorial Strategy. And it's just my pleasure to welcome you here on a very cold night, so you get complete credit for coming out. But I think it's because we'll have a terrific program on the history behind our world-class collection of European porcelain, which is now on view in the new ceramic gallery in the Eloise Martin Galleries, also newly installed. And so tonight you're going to hear from one of the curators who worked in close collaboration with our architectural partners, Barozzi Vega, to reimagine these galleries, and that is Christopher "Kit" Maxwell. But before we begin, and before I say a few words about Kit, I want to start by taking a moment to personally congratulate Kit, not just on the stunning new galleries, but also on his recent promotion to Chair and Eloise W. Martin Curator of Applied Arts of Europe. I think I'm making him blush, but... So Kit joined the museum in 2022 as the Samuel and M. Patricia Grober Curator, and he brought expertise in European ceramics and glass with a special interest in the impacts of global trade and colonial expansion on the development of European design. And he came to us from previous roles at the Corning Museum of Glass, the Royal Collection Trust, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. Here at the Art Institute, Kit has contributed to the growth and development of the Applied Arts of Europe department in just those few years, and really sought to expand the stories that we tell through acquisitions and collection research. And the newly installed galleries are exquisite. I do hope that you get a chance to see them if you haven't already, and we truly value the vision, expertise, and dedication that Kit brings to the museum. So again, Kit, on behalf of all of us at the museum, congratulations on your new role. So now with that, I would like to welcome Kit to the stage to share more about European porcelain and the throwdown. So, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for that very generous introduction. I am blushing. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening to speak about a subject that is very close to my heart and, as Sarah mentioned, fresh in my mind. The new galleries of European design covering the period 1600 to 1900 opened this summer, and among their many glories, I think, is the room dedicated to our really world-class collection of European ceramics. Chicago is known in the international museum community and the art world more broadly as being a ceramic city. And if you take a walk through our glamorous new galleries upstairs and a closer look at any of the labels, you'll see the generosity of generations of local collectors and donors who have contributed to the richness of our collections through gifts and also through the support of acquisitions. And working with the ceramics here is really one of the great joys of my role and one of the great attractions that brought me to Chicago several years ago. But porcelain today is a fairly mundane material. We can buy it industrially produced for mass retail in homeware stores. And without a second thought, we put it in our dishwashers, we stack it in our cupboards, and we replace it whenever we need to or even want to. And we might even reject it for being too old-fashioned and out of step with current trends. But that wasn't the case in the 1700s. In fact, it was quite the opposite. In Europe, and indeed in the American colonies, porcelain was a harbinger of modernity, and it was a pioneering vehicle of artistic expression and also, crucially, of technical innovation. And in this talk, I would like to draw on the Art Institute's fabulous collection and offer you a potted history, as it were, of some of Europe's most important porcelain factories during the 18th century and explain to you a little bit about why and how they were such a major part of the continent's cultural, economic, and indeed political identities. In the autumn of 1700, the fashionable Parisian Gazette, the Mercure Galant, reported that the 15-year-old Duchesse de Bourgogne had stopped her carriage just outside the porcelain manufactory at Saint-Cloud, southwest of Paris, so that she could examine, quote, a quantity of fine porcelain, the like of which does not exist in all Europe. The Duchesse had recently married her cousin, the Duc de Bourgogne, who was the grandson of Louis XIV, and they would have become King and Queen of France had they not died from measles in 1712. But the porcelain she viewed probably looked something like the vase on the left, a creamy white body with blue decoration in a style that was characteristic of the factory of Saint-Cloud at that time. And as the Mercure Galant accurately reported, in the autumn of 1700, this kind of glassy white ceramic was not produced anywhere else in Europe. The factory had one other royal connection. It was under the protection of Philippe Duc d'Orléans, who was the king's brother. He was an avid collector of porcelain imported from Asia, which until that time was the only available source of the material. Consequently, the Duke appreciated the prestige of supporting Europe's first commercially viable porcelain industry. And equally, it's worth noting that so costly and so risky was this experimental industry that any venture that hoped for success really depended upon a private and ideally a royal sponsor. Saint-Cloud's use of blue decoration on its creamy white porcelain body was inspired by the general aesthetic of Asian prototypes, but its ornament was distinctly French. And you can see here how it is drawn from French ornamental prints, which dated to some 100 years before. Adopting this distinctly French aesthetic quickly naturalized this innovative new material, porcelain, into the repertoire of French design and courtly life. And this was a cultural program that was overseen by King Louis XIV himself, the self-styled Sun King, who determined that French artistry and craftsmanship should be an instrument of national glory and political prestige under his auspices. That a fashionable journal like the Mercure Galant should report on the Duchesse de Bourgogne examining porcelain demonstrates that at the dawn of the 1700s, porcelain, especially European-made porcelain, was considered a novel commodity, hitherto known only as an import from Asia. And the establishment of a European porcelain industry was a worthy object of national interest and of royal patronage. But all this begs the question, what is it about this material that makes it so special, and what made it so desirable in Europe? And to answer that question, we should first understand a little bit about its history in Europe, and what made it so different from any other kind of ceramic that had been produced there before 1700. The Chinese began producing what we now recognize as porcelain during the Tang dynasty in around the 7th century. And porcelain began arriving in increasing quantities in Europe from the early 1500s, thanks to newly opened ocean trade routes with Asia, firstly operated by the Portuguese and later by the Dutch. Chinese porcelain was a uniquely light, delicate, translucent, vitreous ceramic with a glossy, tactile glazed surface with striking blue decoration that emphasized the novel whiteness of the porcelain body. It was unlike anything else made in Europe at that time. And as a product of a distant and fascinating civilization, Chinese porcelain quickly became a desirable luxury good. And you can see here that Bellini and Titian clearly imagined that it's the sort of material suitable for use in the feast of the gods, as depicted in their painting. By the 1600s, the Dutch East India Company had become the dominant European trading corporation around the Indian Ocean. And from its headquarters in Jakarta, it supplied spices and porcelains to markets around Asia and also, of course, into Europe. On the left here is a dish that was made of Japanese porcelain, decorated in the desirable blue and white Chinese palette, with the monogram of the Dutch East India Company in the center, VOC. The Japanese perfected porcelain production in the early 1600s, and as the only European foreigners granted trading privileges with Japan, the Dutch had unique access to the Japanese porcelain kilns. By around 1700, the taste for imported Asian blue and white porcelain had reached the levels of a mania. Chinese and Japanese kilns produced a variety of export models and designs, and porcelain became fully integrated into the aristocratic interior. On the left here, you see a group or a garniture of 5 vases we recently acquired on display in the galleries upstairs. They're over 2 feet tall. They're exceptionally rare, and it's very unusual to find a complete set like this. But these are designs that were typical of export porcelain. That is to say, there was no domestic market for these sorts of models or designs in China or Japan. And on the right, you see how they might have been displayed, possibly within a chimney piece during the summer months when the fire was not lit. But look around this room and you'll see that on almost every horizontal surface is a cluster or a pile of porcelain. And it's this passion for porcelain, emphasizing the impact of imported Chinese and Japanese blue and white, that we've tried to evoke in the new galleries upstairs. In many ways, you can think of blue and white porcelain as the first truly global brand. As I mentioned, the Dutch were Europe's leading importers of Chinese porcelain in the 1600s, but they also had a well-established native pottery industry of their own. The shape and the palette of the vase on the left here clearly evoke Chinese porcelain imports. But this vase is not made of delicate, high-fired porcelain, but rather a coarse, low-fired clay which has been covered in an opaque white glaze. It was made in the Netherlands in the famous pottery-making town of Delft. The scene on the side of it is copied from a frontispiece, which you see on the right here, taken from an illustrated publication recounting a Dutch mission to China in the mid-1600s, at a time when China had temporarily closed its doors to foreign trade. And the purpose of this mission was to negotiate the reopening of trade with the Dutch. However, this hiatus in commerce and the temporary pause on the import of Chinese porcelain into Europe allowed the Dutch potters to perfect their formulas and techniques to create an imitation of Chinese porcelain that could meet the market demand for blue and white ceramics. And this vase is really a perfect embodiment, I think, in so many ways of the impact of geopolitics on design. It's an unequivocal expression of the ambition of the Dutch potters to emulate Chinese blue and white porcelain and to stimulate a market for their own native Dutch ceramics. And simultaneously, the iconography of its decoration illustrates the importance of Chinese trade to the economy of the Dutch Republic. At first glance, Europe's pottery imitations of Chinese porcelain were quite convincing. On the left, you see a dish typical of the sorts that were exported from China into Europe, made of porcelain. And on the right, you see a European response. This is made in the Netherlands at Delft as well. It's a pottery dish covered in white glaze and decorated in a similar fashion. But the two ceramics are very, very different. The main difference is that Chinese porcelain is fired at a much higher temperature, around 2400 degrees, making it a hard, non-porous and translucent ceramic, while earthenware is fired at a lower temperature, resulting in a softer, porous material that is typically opaque. And this difference in the firing temperature is due to porcelain's use of a particular type of clay known as kaolin, which requires a higher temperature to fully vitrify and become durable. And that's quite unlike the simpler clay recipes used for earthenware. The low firing temperature of earthenware, which is typically between 1800 and 2200 degrees, results in a more porous, non-vitrified ceramic that has to be coated with a glaze to make it watertight. Earthenware also contains impurities, which give them a sort of distinctive brown or reddish color. And therefore, in the example on the right, you see the clay has to be covered in a glaze that is tinted with tin oxide to make it white so that it could copy the aesthetic of porcelain. Porcelain, you see an example here on the left, is naturally white all the way through. It can be much more finely potted and is much more finely grained. These characteristics also result in the two ceramics feeling very different. And porcelain was admired in Europe for its physical, tactile qualities as well. It was particularly suitable for use in another increasingly fashionable social pursuit, namely tea, coffee, and chocolate drinking. Tea and porcelain were joint imports from Asia, where porcelain had long been integrated into tea drinking practices on account of the fact it was resistant to thermal shock. If you poured hot water onto European pottery, the glaze would just crack and shatter. I'm not a chemist, and I happen to know there's at least one chemistry degree in the audience, but I would like to underscore the difference between pottery and porcelain. Otherwise, I think the marvel of porcelain, and therefore the whole point of this talk, is going to be a little bit lost. And the best and most seasonal analogy I can think of is a comparison between holiday cookies and Christmas cake. The former, cookies, are baked at a high temperature. They're more thin, delicate, crunchy. The latter, the Christmas cake, is thicker, more moist, coarse, and is covered with a layer of white icing. I'm looking at our conservators in the audience, and I believe they're shaking their heads in despair. The problem was, until the 1700s, as much as the Europeans admired and enjoyed cookies, porcelain, they could only make the cake, pottery. And when you crave cookies, a slice of cake simply doesn't cut it. I'll leave it there for now. A fantastic example of this mania for imported Chinese porcelain in Europe in the early 1700s is the case study of Augustus II, who was King of Poland and Elector of Saxony, which was then an independent state, now part of unified Germany. The vases on the right are part of a famous group in the Dresden State Collection called the de Grün vases, which take their name from the circumstances of their acquisition. Because in the spring of 1717, Augustus traded 600 fully equipped cavalrymen, or dragoons, for 151 Chinese porcelain vases, then in the collection of Frederick William I of Prussia. Augustus self-diagnosed with a maladie de porcelaine, or a porcelain sickness. This was the extent of his obsession with the so-called white gold. Other critics describe China as the bleeding bowl of Europe. Such were the fortunes being spent on importing its luxury commodities. So obviously, whichever European state could replicate the formula for Asian porcelain stood to make great economic and also cultural gains. And so that's why when the Duchesse de Bourgogne stopped at the Saint-Cloud porcelain factory, which was then the only commercially viable enterprise in Europe, the Mercure Galant was so eager to report it to its readers. But to the untrained eye and hands, there is very little, actually, that distinguishes the white French porcelain from the Chinese. But it was not exactly the same formula. Although its glassy white body is more convincing a match than the white glazed pottery, it was a different composition to Chinese porcelain. It lacked the crucial kaolin clay, which is what vitrifies at the very high temperatures. So its behavioral qualities were in fact quite different. It was not as resistant to thermal shock as Chinese porcelain, so that was problematic. And it was very volatile in the kiln, which made it very expensive to produce because there was so much wastage. And in the field, this kind of porcelain is referred to as soft paste porcelain. Oh boy. So I have just differentiated between porcelain and pottery in terms of cookies and cakes. But just as there are many types of cookies, so there are several types of porcelain. Yet all are still cookies and all are still porcelain. And so we see here how we might distinguish between soft paste and hard paste, a similarity between soft gooey cookies baked at a slightly lower temperature and hard crispy cookies baked at a higher temperature. But the key difference in the recipes for these two formulae is kaolin, this kaolin clay. And the discovery of kaolin as the secret ingredient to true porcelain, close to the Chinese formula, was actually developed in Saxony just a few years after St. Cloud by the aforementioned Augustus the Strong, Augustus II. The story of its discovery was somewhat serendipitous and not entirely as you would expect. Because at that time, the early 1700s, Augustus was holding prisoner a particularly young and ambitious alchemist called Johann Friedrich Böttger, who was tasked with the impossible mission of transmuting base metals into gold. And in the process of his experiments, he needed to develop crucibles which could withstand the high firing temperatures of the furnaces in which he was attempting to melt metals. And in so doing, he developed a high-fired, vitreous, iron-red ceramic made with local deposits of what turned out to be kaolin. Refinement of this formula over several years led to the eventual successful production of an experimental white porcelain. Nevertheless, a porcelain factory was established in 1710 within the security of the Albrechtsburg Castle in Meissen, which is just outside of Dresden, where experiments on this new white porcelain could continue in absolute secrecy and security. The true commercially viable porcelain was developed several years later in 1713. However, in the meantime, during a comparatively short period of just about 5 years, these polished reddish-brown ceramics, these sort of proto-porcelains, enjoyed enormous prestige. They were often referred to as jasper porcelain because of their color, but also because of their hardness allowed them to be treated as if they were semi-precious stones. The alchemist Johann Friedrich Böttger oversaw a team of specialist assistants that included silversmiths, glass cutters, stone polishers, all to develop a variety of virtuoso designs that would appeal to a noble clientele. And on the screen here, you see some examples in our collection which reveal the variety of decorative techniques they deployed. You see here examples that were copied directly from silver prototypes, examples that were designed by goldsmiths, examples that have been engraved by glass cutters, and others that have been cut by stone polishers. They're really, really fabulous things, although at first glance, this sort of brown color makes them seem somewhat ordinary, but a closer look reveals just how special they are. And I'd like to share just this one detail with you, probably my favorite piece, this little teapot. Tea was still in the early 1700s a very expensive imported commodity. It was only available really to the aristocratic elite, so teapots themselves were very, very precious things. This jasper porcelain example has been cut and polished with this wonderful geometric sort of honeycomb pattern after it was fired. So imagine doing all this. Imagine cutting a ceramic on a stone cutter's wheel and then polishing it, abrasively polishing the surface. It's amazing that this thing didn't shatter into thousands of pieces. It's a real virtuoso work of art. And this polished surface, not wishing to mix my seasonal analogies, gives it sort of the appeal of an Easter egg. You really want to lay your hands on it and sort of enjoy it. But after the development or the perfection of a commercially viable true white porcelain at Meissen in 1713, Augustus II ordered the end of the production of these red wares. And thereafter, true white porcelain became fully integrated into European artistic production with rapid developments in paste, in firing technologies, and in enamel colors. And these four objects represent the first generation of Meissen's white porcelain and really show its quick evolution from strict dependence on Asian prototypes and the development of a pure white paste to more confident expressions of a European design sensibility and also the refinement of chemically compatible gilding techniques and enamel colors. And the little wine pot on the far right is just an absolute joy with this sort of monkey reaching towards the ho-ho bird at the bottom. It really, I think, embodies the delight that people experienced in porcelain during this period. I just want to show you the installation upstairs because I think if there's one display that you make time to see on your next visit here, again, I speak with complete bias, but do stop in and take a look. This group of early Meissen porcelain and the red jasper porcelain is an acquisition that we made earlier this year, and it's immediately put Chicago on the map as the most important collection of this material in the United States. It's such an exquisite assemblage. I'm so happy that it's in this city. By the 1730s, Meissen's white porcelain had evolved to cater to all aspects of European courtly and noble cultural life. And this installation upstairs, which is directly opposite the blue and white display I showed a moment ago, shows you how quickly porcelain design evolved and was adopted, especially within traditions of aristocratic table culture. You might recognize many sort of serving vessels and tableware among the designs here. This is a detail of one of them. It's sort of monstrously beautiful. It was designed for the Saxon Prime Minister, Heinrich Count von Brühl, who served also as the administrator of the Royal Saxon Porcelain Manufactory at Meissen, which really underscores the importance of porcelain within statecraft and politics. But as the factory's administrator, Brühl was expected to be an active patron, and an inventory taken at his death in 1763 reveals that he probably, he owned at least 7 Meissen porcelain services. This centerpiece was part of his first commission, which he placed in the mid-1730s. And it's a rather exuberant and unashamedly Baroque design, which alludes to porcelain's Chinese origins, but also celebrates the sculptural capabilities of Meissen's modelers, and also the skill of the factory's kiln technicians, which enabled such a complex sculptural piece to survive the firing temperatures and all the warping and shrinkage that occurs over the numerous firings that a piece like this has to undergo. It's quite miraculous, given the technology that was available at the time. These two pieces are from another service commissioned by the Count von Brühl, and they really do celebrate the purity and the plastic qualities of Meissen's paste, of which it was justly proud at this moment. Undoubtedly, these pieces come from the most celebrated of Brühl's commissions. It's what's known as the Swan Service. It was begun in 1736 and comprised originally of over 2,000 pieces. It took 5 years to complete, being finally delivered in 1742. At this time, Meissen porcelain was still considered too precious for actual use in dining and was primarily intended for representational purposes and for diplomatic gifts. So it's probable that the Swan Service was really only used for display, possibly as a grand centerpiece or on a buffet on a sideboard, while diners used more accessible materials like silver or imported Chinese porcelain for the dessert courses with which porcelain was most usually associated. The dish on the right is delicately molded with this really subtle relief decoration, as well as enameled with the Brühl coats of arms. Note the pair of swans in the center here. You might just be able to see them, from which, of course, the service takes its name. And these this pair of swans is a recurring motif that alludes probably to the recent marriage of Brühl and his wife. And this aquatic theme is also a play on words. The word pool in colloquial German, dialectic German, refers to marshland. So you see this sort of watery iconography throughout the service. And the shell on the left is A, beautiful, and B, functional as a confectionery box. The top half is removable as a lid. But the most significant expression of the new sculptural possibility of European porcelain came in the early 1730s with a remarkable commission from Augustus II for a porcelain menagerie. Over 300 large-scale models were developed of different animals that were destined for the principal floor of the Japanese palace in Dresden, which you see on the right. This was a residence that was designed specifically to house the king's porcelain collections. The project pushed the technical and artistic abilities of this new factory to an entirely new level. And you can see the spirit of experimentation, of trial, and indeed error in many of the finished pieces. If you take a look around the base of our king vulture, which is life-size, it's enormous, and it was modeled from the life, from a living example in the Royal Menagerie. But if you look around the base, here you'll see some firing cracks. And you'll also notice how the glaze stops about an inch or so from the bottom to prevent it sticking to the floor of the kiln. So they were still figuring things out at the factory, but this commission was a total tour de force. And the menagerie, this extraordinary commission from Augustus II, had a profound impact on European taste. As the continent's leading European porcelain factory, Meissen's sculptural wares were in demand across Europe, and animals quickly became one of their most popular models. These particular lions, these are a recent acquisition, and they're about the size of guinea pigs, I would say. They're also not life-size happily, but chunky things. They were designed in 1748 at the command of the Saxon electress Maria Josepha. And they ultimately made their way to Paris, where the city's guild of luxury designers had them mounted on these gilt bronze bases. There's a wonderful expressiveness to their faces, something almost human-like. And it's easy to write it off as naive or sort of primitive, sort of not a misunderstanding of the anatomy of lions. But we know that these lions were also sculpted from life by a talented sculptor, an experienced sculptor who was studying the lions in the Royal Menagerie. These faces, in fact, tap into some of the most profound philosophical, religious, and scientific debates that were circulating in Europe at that time, namely the place of humans in the natural world, the nature of feelings and of sentiment, and whether animals have souls. So there is a real cultural gravity to these objects. And it's this disconnect, I think, from the cultural climate in which porcelain figures originated that has led, I think, to one of the biggest misunderstandings about what they are today. They're so often dismissed as kitsch or weird or merely decorative, when in fact they were truly pioneering in using both a modern, sophisticated material, but also in the way in which they explored the most current philosophical debates and the preoccupations of their era. Many of these objects were intended for display in private rooms or for use on dining tables where they would have prompted conversation. They were really keyed into the intellectual climate of the time. On the screen here is the monkey band, which is one of the most loved objects in our ceramics collection, produced in Meissen in the mid-18th century. It embodies a long artistic history of satirical depictions of monkeys aping humans. But this all found new relevance in the debates of the 18th century about the distinctions between mankind and the natural and the animal world, and also the evolution of courtly codes of behavior and deportment. It's a very, very sophisticated concept, as fun as they are to look at as well, and a little unsettling. But back to the main story as a sidebar. But despite the strict security and really severe threats of punishment to rogue workers, espionage and competition won the day in the European porcelain industry. And with a few years of Meissen's founding in 1710, other true porcelain factories were cropping up around Europe. In 1717, Claudius Innocentius Dupaquier, quite a name, who was an agent in the Austrian Imperial Council of War, which was a military ministry, decided to open a porcelain factory. Imagine. But through his diplomatic connections, he was able to poach several key employees from the Meissen Manufactory. He brought over a porcelain painter, an expert in fabricating kilns, and the very kiln master who had worked closely with the alchemist Johann Friedrich Böttger since 1705, and who brought with him the recipe for the porcelain paste. Dupaquier also succeeded in securing imperial protection. On May 27th, 1718, Charles VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, who you see here on the right, granted him a privilege or an exclusive right to establish a porcelain factory in Vienna. The 25-year patent was for the manufacture of, quote, all sorts of fine porcelain, such as are made in East India and other foreign countries. The initial efforts of the Dupaquier factory were less focused on new sculptural models like at Meissen, but more on expanding the range of enamel colors, which were very complex metal oxide formulas that had to be exactly compatible with both the paste and with the glaze. Sorry, I should point out that the tureen on the left is a fabulous example of the range of colors that Dupaquier produced in their crispness and their sort of distinctively Viennese. The pattern you see on the tureen is of Asian origin. It's the sort of design you might even find on imported Chinese wallpaper at the time, but it's the colors that set this tureen apart as being truly exceptional. By contrast, on the right is a teapot that is sort of following Asian prototypes, but again, it's through European eyes. The raised figures on its sides here copy the sorts of raised decoration you might find on imported Asian lacquer at the time. And the teapot has been left undecorated in a celebration of the success, of the purity of Dupacier's porcelain paste. But with its privilege from the emperor and its courtly clientele, Dupacier's factory also produced pieces that played a key role in international diplomacy. The tureen on the left is a model that was devised in 1735 for an entire service that was sent to the Tsarina Anna Ivanova, probably as a gift from Emperor Charles VI. The seated figure of the Ottoman on the top alludes to an ultimately unsuccessful alliance between Austria and Russia against the Ottomans at this moment. And the gaming box on the right, which is one of the great treasures and joys of our collection, with its King of Diamonds on the outside, and you see in the inside the Queen of Hearts, was also intended to serve a role in forging this alliance. It's a wonderful thing. It's set with solid gold, so this isn't gilt metal, it's solid gold and diamonds. And it really serves, I think, as a powerful reminder of the prestige of porcelain at this moment, but also given its function of the unique tactile qualities of the material, the smoothness of its impermeable surface, and the bright, unfading nature of the fired enamels made it a material like any other. And of course, this glossy glaze that covered it all. And just imagine how this ensemble would have sparkled in the candlelit gaming tables of the Russian court. Emperor Charles VI died in 1740, and this sculpture on the left was possibly conceived by the factory, Dupacier's factory, in commemoration of his reign. And its composition is perfectly in step with the style of classicizing Baroque sculpture one might expect to find in bronze or in ivory, as you see on the right, an ivory sculpture in the Viennese Kunstkammer. Yet rendered in porcelain, it immediately becomes something unique. It's a product of modern innovation and scientific triumph as much as it is a representation of artistic skill. And this was something that was this sort of coding was very, very much understood in the early days of European porcelain production. In 1744, Dupacchier's 25-year patent expired, and his business was acquired by the state and became the Imperial Porcelain Manufactory. And it was given the remit then to align its products with the standards of the Hof Academy, that is, the Imperial Court Academy of Art. From then on, both the Academy and the Porcelain Manufactory operated under the same administration and were expected to satisfy the needs of the court. The Porcelain Manufactory was called upon to produce figures that reflected academic themes, such as classical mythology, and rendered them in a style that was prescribed by the Academy. Both sculptors and designers were active across both institutions simultaneously. The ability to color porcelain also added to its popularity, particularly as table ornamentation, and it began to replace more ephemeral sugar sculptures, which had previously been the norm at the formal dinners and banquets that were really the theatres of statecraft in the political life of European courts. The Imperial Porcelain Manufactory and the court confectionery in Vienna were closely connected as well, and senior court officials the same senior court officials were associated with them both. And a court ordinance of 1758 records the command of Archduchess Maria Theresa, whom you see here on the right, that every table should be set with, quote, nothing other than porcelain and natural flowers, year in, year out, every day. And this centerpiece on the left is part of a much larger scheme, multiple pieces, intended for display on the dining table, particularly the dessert table. It represents Triton and a Nereid, or a sea nymph, riding a hippocampus, which is a mythical sea creature. And this rocky terrace that you see them presented upon is, you might notice, perforated. You see little holes in it. And a lit scented pastel would have been placed underneath this terrace so that a perfume would have wafted out and crossed the dessert table. So I think by the time we reach the mid-1700s, we might reasonably identify the golden age of European porcelain production, because by this time, porcelain had become really essential to the idea and the ideals of the Rococo, which was not a movement led by architects like the Baroque, but a movement that was led by designers and craftspeople, and a movement that took root in the rich intellectual soil of the Enlightenment. And across Europe, philosophers were debating the nature of human consciousness, of questions of feeling, as I mentioned, of sentiment, and also of imagination. So the Rococo emerged as a celebration and an exploration of abstract thought, of freedom of imagination, and of human creativity. There's exuberant asymmetry, and natural forms proliferated, and nowhere could they be more successfully manifest in 3 dimensions than in porcelain. Interestingly, the term Rococo derives from the word rocaille, which comes from which is a name given to a type of decoration, architectural decoration, the application of stones and of shells to exterior buildings like grottos. And likewise, the term porcelain derives from the Italian word porcella, a term used to describe a cowrie shell. So in both material and in design, porcelain could perfectly represent the spirit of the Rococo, as you see with this gorgeous ewer and basin on the right. So at this time, in the mid-1700s, France had really cemented its position as Europe's cultural leader. In fashion and in design, it dazzled the continent with the brilliance of its creations. And in no small part was this due to the strategic patronage and taste of the nation's most powerful woman, Madame de Pompadour, who was the official mistress of Louis XV. And it was both her interest in porcelain and her influence over the king that gave rise to Europe's most important porcelain industry in the mid-18th century. Saxony had been rather weakened by the 7 Years' War, and the productions of Meissen were now less sought after and less popular throughout Europe. And this gave the French factory a chance to take its place at the helm. Founded in the disused chateau of Vincennes to the east of Paris in 1745, this factory had perfected its formula to such an extent that it could become commercially viable. And it was awarded the protection of a royal privilege, which gave it the monopoly of producing porcelain, quote, painted and gilded and with human figures. It's telling that this privilege was so important and so prestigious that the king granted it while he was at a military encampment in the Flanders. By 1759, the king had purchased the factory as crown property, and it became fully integrated into France's program of cultural and artistic supremacy. Deep, rich ground colors became the factory's hallmark and their most celebrated innovation. The palette of these colors was uniquely compatible with the soft paste formula that was retained by the French factories. Kaolin was not discovered in France until the late 1760s, by which time the aesthetic potential of soft paste porcelain was too well established to be immediately overturned. And so with the support of the crown, the factory was expected to release new models and ground colors on a regular basis, meeting the French court's relentless demand for novelty. These new models were debuted every year on New Year's Day in the king's apartments at Versailles, where courtiers were expected to show their support of the monarchy by making exorbitantly expensive purchases. This particular combination of blue and green ground was fashionable for just a short period, around 1760, and it has the added distinction of the gilding, which was a privilege, which was an exclusive privilege of the royal factory. Adding enormously to the cost of the porcelain were these painted scenes, which were often copying popular prints or paintings. They're especially prestigious since figure painting was another prerogative of the royal factory, something that the royal factory had the exclusive right over. But the process, let alone the skill, of painting in enamel colors was so technically and chemically challenging that a painted scene like this on Sèvres porcelain was worth many more times the value of the original painting on which it was based. But also just take a look for a second at the swirling Rococo form of the foot on this vase. It's like a sort of spaniel's foot. You can almost imagine it scampering away. It's true Rococo creativity at its very best, I think. Well, this vase, with its particularly difficult to perfect pink ground, which was launched the very year this example was made, is admittedly hard to love by our eyes. Its expressive elephant heads we might now be able to understand in the context of these Enlightenment debates, but they still appear somewhat bizarre. But it really shows the confidence and the mastery with which Sèvres developed its formulas and also its models. And this is particularly evident when you compare it to the vase on the right, which is the type of Chinese blue and white vase that would have been its inspiration. You see the counterparts with the elephant's heads, with the reserves that run around the body and with the floral decoration. But they've all undergone a process of unmistakable Frenchification. You might not love it, but I think you can probably appreciate the innovation and the accomplishment here. Sèvres porcelain became the most expensive in Europe, and the most costly service it ever produced was for the Empress Catherine the Great of Russia in 1776. It was an order placed by the Russian ambassador to Paris. It comprised over 800 items for 60 settings and is known as the service au camé, or cameo service. It cost a staggering cost over 330,000 French livres at a time when the average laborer earned 100 livres a year. So it was an immense sum, and the production nearly bankrupted the company, and the final payments weren't made until 1792, so almost 15 years, around 15 years later. This is one of many plates in the service. We only have this one example. A single plate cost 400 livres, so 4 times the annual salary of a laborer. The factory was highly organized, with a single object passing through numerous specialist hands on its route to completion. And for quality control, each of these workers was required to sign off by leaving their mark on the piece. It's quite a work of art. So we see the interlaced L's, which give us the factory mark for Louis. The date letter AA, the date letters changed every year, so we know this is 1778. We see the artist's mark for the worker responsible for the flowers. We see the mark of the artist responsible for the cipher in the center. We see the mark of the artist responsible for the cameo decoration, which were copied from the king's private collection of ancient cameos. And we see the mark of the gilder, who is responsible for the lavish gold leaf decoration that runs around its borders. Time for a gear change. We now cross to Britain, where porcelain production also flourished by the mid-1700s, but under very different circumstances. The first British porcelain factories were entrepreneurial endeavors and did not benefit from the security of royal or noble underwriting. It was a competitive, high-risk industry, and few factories lasted for more than a couple of decades. Consequently, those with knowledge of porcelain making usually circulated around several factories. The Chelsea porcelain factory produced some of its most innovative and charming wares during the 1750s, such as this rare rabbit tureen, which would have been fitted with a metal liner to allow for the easy removal of its contents. The Chelsea factory also looked to France for inspiration. On the right, you see a little milk pot made at the Sèvres Manufactory. You can see clearly how it inspired the Chelsea factory in London some years later. Both, I should say, were made of soft paste porcelain. The English introduced bone china a little later, which is another recipe altogether, but I will not dwell on. I have no baked goods to show you in its illustration. But English porcelain is often wonderfully eccentric. So compare here the 2 English plates on the right with the kind of courtly formality of the French plate on the left. These porcelain plates with botanical decorations were produced by Chelsea around 1755 and are often referred to as Hans Sloane's wares in reference to the eponymous royal physician, traveller, collector, and natural historian who was a central figure of the British Enlightenment. And Sloane helped to transform the Chelsea Physic Garden in London to a centre of botanical knowledge in the early 1700s. And I just love the contrast here with this sort of weird snaking cactus and then an exploding melon on the right. And these are 2 recent acquisitions which will soon be out in our galleries too. The botanical specimens on these plates were taken from a variety of sources, and here you can see the source of the cactus illustrated by Philip Miller, who was curator of the Chelsea Physic Garden, which was, in fact, just down the road from the porcelain manufactory. While it can be eccentric, it can also be ravishingly beautiful, and this is another new acquisition, a group depicting Ganymede and the eagle, referring to the classical myth of the god Zeus, who transformed himself into an eagle in order to carry away the beautiful soldier Ganymede with whom he had fallen in love, carried him to Mount Olympus, where he was installed as his cupbearer. And there is just, I think, a ravishing sensitivity in this composition, and I am so thrilled. This extremely rare model is now in our collection. Only 8 examples of it are known. Porcelain was remarkably adaptable to changing tastes, and you contrast these two pieces that were made in Vienna. On the left, that one, we've seen already the centerpiece responding to the mood of the Rococo, the dynamism and energy of the Rococo. And then on the right, the restraint of the neoclassical period, these two ice cream coolers in the shape of Greek vases, which might also have graced a dessert table, just like the centerpiece that preceded them. By 1800, the whiteness of porcelain was no longer novel, and new inexpensive methods had been developed for gilding. And this vase, commissioned in 1805 by Napoleon, is a wonderful example of these new technologies and also of unabashed splendor. It's a superb example of the Empire style inspired by Greco-Roman art. It was commissioned in 1805 by Napoleon, but it was only completed in 1813 and was still at the factory when Napoleon was exiled the following year. But it was used as a diplomatic gift from his successor, King Louis XVIII, to Viscount Castlereagh, who was the British Foreign Secretary. Louis XVIII owed Castlereagh and the British a great debt in the defeat of Napoleon and the consequent restoration of the French monarchy. And this splendid vase was evidently deemed a suitable expression of his gratitude. And I show you this very quickly just to give you a sense of the scale of this thing. It's enormous. It's a piece of furniture. And I'd like to wrap up with another example of a monumental piece, and one that, although it's about 100 years later, is of particular relevance to Chicago. This huge punch bowl was produced for the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. It was, in fact, a trial piece. It never made it across the Atlantic at that time. But you see the finished version on the right, which, on close inspection, you can observe was polychromed, was colored. The piece that recently entered our collection and is now on display was probably rejected because it has firing flaws around its base. So a demonstration still of the complexity of firing pieces like this. It's now on display in the center of our gallery's pride of place. Its iconography probably alludes to the reunification of Germany in 1871, and it was sent to Chicago at a time when 1 in 5 Chicagoans was of direct German descent. There were 200 German newspapers circulating in Chicago at the time, and so the factory was trying to tap into the new American market. And I'm thrilled that we can connect this remarkable material and its rich history in Europe with the story of our city. So this has been a romp through about 100 years of porcelain, and I hope it's given you a sense, or dare I labor the analogy, a flavor, of the delicious variety and the delight of this remarkable material and the defining role it has played in European cultural life. Over the holiday period, as you are facing the rather tedious task of unloading your porcelain from your dishwasher, just imagine the wonder and the excitement such an activity would have caused the Duchesse de Bourgogne or Augustus II. Thank you very much. Thank you. We're right at 7 o'clock, so I realize there are dinner reservations, so please don't hesitate to leave if you need to. But we do have some time for questions if anyone would like to linger. Do raise your hand. We have two colleagues of mine are here with microphones, and they will help you to offer your question.
Oh, hi. Did the development of European porcelain factories impede or impact the importation of Chinese and Japanese porcelain?
It certainly did in terms of the value. So porcelain is very useful because it could act as ballast in ships that were returning from China. So it had a practical function too. But of course, it immediately became much less desirable. And so porcelain became more affordable to a broader demographic. So it impeded the desirability in aristocratic circles, certainly, of Asian porcelain, but it was still a commodity in Europe for some time to come.
Thank you. This was really fascinating. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you could speak more to the workers, the artists, what kind of relationship did they have with their patrons? Were they considered artists, or were they treated more like craftsmen?
That's a fantastic question. So the royal factories of Europe, the royal sponsored factories, leave behind fairly good archives. So we have a sense of who the workers were, how much they were paid, and so have a sense of their sort of social standing. So it was certainly, being a porcelain worker was certainly a prestigious career within the realm of craft and industry. There was, certainly in the early days, the preciousness of the porcelain recipe made anyone who was A, familiar with it, or B, competent in producing it, an extremely desirable employee. So porcelain makers could negotiate carriages and servants and liveries and so on. And we have evidence of that as well. So yes, in the early days, porcelain makers and craftspeople were certainly well regarded. The British porcelain factories leave very little behind because they were entrepreneurial businesses and didn't really keep great records.
Hi, thank you so much for this lecture. It was awesome. I did have a question. When this new European market opened up for Chinese and Japanese porcelain, did that affect the styles of porcelain being produced in China and Japan at all, or was it exclusively the traditional styles that were being produced there?
The Chinese had an established export relationship, not just with Europe, but around Asia and also the Middle East. So they were producing wares that were very much tailored to the export markets they were catering to. So they had a different sensibility for export wares than domestic products. But then as the trade became more formalized, specialized commissions could be placed. The East India merchants could specify the types of decoration they wanted, or indeed the design, the models that they wanted the Chinese factories to produce. It became much more organized.
Hi, I had a quick question about Chinese porcelain. Was it a trade secret that they kind of kept, like they did with silk production, that they didn't really share the technique on how to make porcelain or what the secret ingredient was to make that fine porcelain?
Exactly. It was a very closely guarded secret. Missionaries in the late 17th century, missionaries were able to access the porcelain workshops, but the terminology used by Chinese workshops didn't really obviously translate into well, they happened to be German, but it didn't really mean anything. So it was truly a question of reinventing the wheel back in Europe. So they were aware of this particular type of clay, but they were not allowed access to it to analyze it in a way that might have been helpful right from the start.
Thank you so much for the talk. I have a question about, so I know in Chinese porcelain factories, seconds or flawed items would sometimes, were often destroyed and put into landfills to protect the material from getting into the hands of the wrong classes, et cetera. Were there any similar practices in Europe?
Interesting. No, the Sèvres factory catered for a variety of price points. I mean, it was all above the kind of reach of the average laborer, let's say, just because functionally it would have no place, and the ability to store it, to clean it, was simply beyond the economic means. You do see, I mean, porcelain was so precious that if it broke, it was often repaired in a way that sort of elevated its value. It's fitted with silver mounts, for example, to conceal breaks, to sort of restore the object to a whole, but simultaneously, of course, fitting it with another precious material. So we find porcelain that has historic breaks, but has been repaired and retained for use.
And that concludes our program. Thank you, Kit.
Thank you.